I froze just inside the doorway when she closed it behind me, the soft click louder than I expected in the quiet of the workshop. "Now be honest," she said, her voice calm. But there was something in the tilt of her head that made my chest tighten. I wanted to say a dozen things, none of which felt quite right. The place smelled of oil and old leather, faint traces of motor oil from the day's repairs, and the faintest hint of jasmine lingering from her perfume. It was a strange combination, familiar yet electric. I shifted my weight from one foot to the other, trying not to stare at the way her hands rested on the edge of the counter, fingers brushing over scattered tools as if she owned not just the space, but the air around it. Her hair, dark with streaks of silver at the temples, fell loosely over one shoulder, catching the late afternoon light through the dusty windows. She had a presence that made you feel simultaneously at ease and out of place, like a melody you half remember but can't place. I could hear the faint scratch of her pen on a notebook, and I noticed the slight pause she took whenever our eyes met. That pause felt deliberate, as if she were testing me, measuring something I wasn't sure I was ready to give. "I know you've been avoiding the truth," she said finally, tilting her head so that one eyebrow lifted ever so slightly. The words themselves weren't harsh, but there was an undertone that prickled my skin. I wanted to laugh, deflect, make a joke about being clumsy with honesty, but the look she gave me made it impossible. For a moment, everything else faded. The clatter of metal, the dim hum of fluorescent lights, even the heat from the radiator by the corner. I found myself noticing her little gestures, the way she tucked a stray strand behind her ear, the way her eyes lingered a second longer on the notebook, the way her lips curved as if she knew a secret she hadn't shared. Something about her made the room smaller, sharper, charged in a way I hadn't expected from someone who, on paper, should have felt untouchable. I cleared my throat and opened my mouth, then closed it again. The words I wanted to say dissolved in the air. She tilted her head slightly, watching, patient but unyielding. It was infuriating and fascinating all at once. My fingers itched to reach out, to do something, anything, but she didn't move, didn't break the tension. It was as if she knew the invisible line I was teetering on and was letting me wrestle with it. Then, almost imperceptibly, she leaned back against the counter, resting her weight just enough to make her posture casual, but not relaxed. There was a softness in her gaze now, a hint of something that made my stomach twist. Not longing exactly, not desire, not yet, but something dangerously close. A flicker of recognition passed between us, subtle, almost shameful in its intensity. I left that workshop with the smell of oil still clinging to my jacket and her words echoing in my head. "Now be honest." The cadence, the way she had said it, the pause before she even spoke, it played over and over. I found myself imagining the tilt of her head, the curve of her smile, and the way she made honesty feel like both a punishment and a gift. And I couldn't stop thinking about it. I showed up the next afternoon, hands greasy from the bike I'd been tinkering with, and found her crouched by a low cabinet, muttering under her breath as she wrestled with a stubborn drawer hinge. "You don't have to do that," I said, though my voice carried a mixture of curiosity and hesitation. She didn't look up, but her shoulders twitched slightly, as if my presence had reminded her that she wasn't alone. "I've got it," she said finally, calm, clipped, almost rehearsed. The words themselves were a wall, but the subtle pause afterward, the one where she let her chest rise a fraction slower, spoke differently. I noticed it, of course. I always noticed the little cracks in her armor. I crouched beside her, pretending to inspect the hinge. My fingers brushed hers for a split second while passing her a tiny screwdriver. She didn't pull away, but the tension in her shoulders spoke volumes. She was capable, confident, someone who rarely let anyone see the friction beneath the surface. But right now, there was hesitation, a flicker of fatigue at the edge of her jaw, a shadow under her eyes that made her look human, vulnerable. "Here," I said softly, trying not to sound like I was intruding, "let me know." She stopped me mid-gesture with a shake of her head, but the twitch of her fingers, the slight tilt of her wrist, betrayed her. Not a refusal born of pride, more like caution. like she was weighing whether to let me in, even just for a moment. I sat back on my heels, silently observing. Her laugh came then, soft, unexpected, when a bolt she had dropped rolled under the radiator. It wasn't full-bodied, not the kind that fills a room, but quiet, almost fragile, like she was surprised by it herself. I realized I could spend hours cataloging these small things. The way her hair curled against her neck, the way her hands flexed over a wrench, the brief, almost imperceptible slump in her spine after she finally got the hinge to click. "You're persistent," she said, finally meeting my eyes, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. There was humor there, yes, but also a hint of exasperation, a touch of something I wasn't supposed to see. We worked in silence after that, side by side. The air between us felt charged in a way that wasn't obvious but undeniable, like static clinging to skin. I noticed how she leaned slightly toward the counter, how her eyes lingered just a little longer on the tools she handed me, and how she sighed. A quiet, almost apologetic exhale. Every time she realized she'd asked for help but didn't want to admit it. When the hinge finally clicked into place, she straightened up and ran a hand down her face, rubbing at her eyes for a moment. I caught a glimpse of tiredness there, deeper than the workday should justify. And yet, she gave me a look, a fleeting, almost mischievous glance, half defiant, half relieved, as if she had just allowed herself to be seen, and it was dangerous, intoxicating. I stayed still, letting the moment hang, savoring the soft pulse between us. She gave a small, almost shy nod toward the drawer, and in that movement, in the quiet exhale, she didn't bother hiding. Something unspoken passed. Something electric. Something that made me want to lean closer. Not in a rush, not in expectation, just to be nearer. And I did. Just slightly. Her breath caught. And that was enough. The workshop smelled damp that evening, rain tapping against the windows in uneven rhythms. I had stayed later than usual, pretending there was more work to do, though I was really just waiting. She was wiping down a counter, and the warm glow of the single overhead lamp caught the silver threads in her hair, making them shimmer like something I shouldn't stare at so long. I leaned against the doorway, pretending to organize my tools, and watched her move. There was a grace in the way she worked, careful and deliberate, but I could see the subtle exhaustion too, the way her shoulders sagged just a fraction when she thought I wasn't looking. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in my throat, tangled up in the awareness that we were teetering on a line neither of us was ready to name. "Do you need help with that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Her head tilted, eyes narrowing just slightly, and she gave me that half smile I couldn't read. "I've got it," she said, but the hesitation in her tone betrayed her. She wanted to say yes, wanted to let me in, but pride, or caution, or something older than both of us, held her back. I stepped closer, pretending to pick something up from the floor, and our hands brushed for a heartbeat longer than necessary. She didn't pull away, but neither did she close the gap. It was electrifying. My stomach tightened. I felt the pull of something unspoken between us. The storm outside pounded in a steady rhythm, echoing the quickened beat of my own pulse. "I should," she began, then stopped, as if remembering something urgent. Her phone vibrated on the counter, and she glanced down, eyes tightening. A name flashed across the screen. A friend, someone from earlier, nothing serious, but it broke the fragile bubble we were suspended in. She exhaled, almost apologetically, and stepped back, creating a space I could feel in my chest. I stayed where I was, resisting the impulse to close the distance, to lean in and let the silence say what words never could. Every instinct screamed to reach out, but every part of me knew that restraint mattered, that rushing this, breaking the fragile trust between us, would ruin everything. She straightened, brushing her hands over her jeans, pretending the tension didn't exist. I noticed the faint tremor in her fingers, the slight catch in her throat when she spoke. I wanted to ask her about it, to offer a word, a touch, something, but I didn't. The lamp flickered, casting a brief shadow over her face, and for a split second, our eyes met, steady, searching, almost confessing. I felt it there, the unspoken words, The almost promise, the silent acknowledgment of everything we were tiptoeing around. Then she moved past me to reach for the door, and I followed, not stepping closer, just close enough that the heat from her shoulder brushed mine. My hand twitched, almost reaching, almost daring to bridge the invisible space between us, but I didn't. She opened the door, glanced back with a small, knowing look, and the rain gusted in. And I almost leaned in. Almost. The rain had stopped by the time I returned the next day, leaving the workshop smelling faintly of wet asphalt and oil. She was sitting on a low stool, legs crossed, flipping through a dog-eared notebook. For a moment, I thought about leaving, letting the silence stretch, but something in the tilt of her head, the way her eyes traced a margin, made me stay. I set my tools down, careful not to make a sound, and watched her. She looked up after a while, just long enough for our eyes to meet, and held my gaze. The air felt heavier somehow, the kind of quiet that presses in, demanding attention. "What are we doing?" she asked finally, voice soft, almost trembling, but not weak. It wasn't a question about work, about schedules or deadlines. It was bigger, deeper. It hung between us like smoke, intangible but impossible to ignore. I hesitated, unsure where to begin. Words felt clumsy, inadequate. I wanted to say something clever, something to diffuse the tension, but I couldn't. She wasn't asking for clever. She was asking for truth, and truth had no easy phrasing. She shifted on the stool, hands gripping the edge as if steadying herself. I noticed the faint tremor in her fingers, the way her shoulders rounded slightly. Vulnerability flashed across her features, fleeting but unmistakable. It was rare to see, and it made my chest tighten in ways I hadn't expected. I don't know, I admitted finally, voice low. I feel like we're always close to something, and then I stopped. The words faltered, because none of them seemed enough. Her lips pressed together, and she let out a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of everything she'd held back. She didn't look away, didn't blink, and it made the moment feel suspended, raw. "It doesn't feel normal," she said quietly, more statement than question. "We can't keep pretending it does." I nodded, unable to articulate the storm inside me. The heat from the radiator did nothing to chase the chill her words left behind. I noticed the lines at the corner of her eyes, the subtle fatigue that underlined her composure, and the way her chest rose and fell slowly, deliberately. We sat like that for a long stretch, neither moving, both aware of how fragile the space between us had become. It wasn't romantic, not yet, but it was intimate in a way that made my stomach knot and my fingers itch with the desire to reach out, to close the distance that wasn't just physical. Finally, she stood, brushing off her jeans, and turned toward the door. She paused, looking back at me, and the small flicker of uncertainty in her eyes made my throat dry. "I'm not sure how much longer I can do this," she said, her voice low, vulnerable, and utterly devastating. And then she left, and I realized I couldn't remember the last time silence had hit harder than her words. I showed up the next morning, hesitant, unsure if she'd even want me there. The workshop was quiet, dust motes floating in the shafts of light from the high windows. She was at her desk, staring at an old photograph, one I hadn't seen before. "Do you ever think about the ones we lost?" she asked suddenly, not looking at me. Her voice was quiet, almost fragile, like she was testing the air before letting anything escape. I knelt beside her, pretending to organize some scattered papers, though my eyes couldn't leave her. "Sometimes," I said softly. "I try not to, but it creeps in anyway." She didn't answer immediately. The photo in her hands trembled slightly. It was a picture of a younger version of her, smiling with someone I didn't recognize. "It was a long time ago," she murmured. I didn't know what I had until it was gone. Her eyes flicked to mine for the briefest second, searching, then darted back to the photo. I realized, almost at the same time, that I had seen that look before, in her eyes, in moments when the laughter didn't reach them, when she smiled but it didn't quite touch her. She was guarded, always, but this was different. Raw, human. "I remember someone like that," I said quietly, the memory surfacing despite my careful restraint. "They leave a mark, don't they? even when you try to move on. She nodded, lips pressed tightly together, eyes glimmering with a mixture of nostalgia and pain. I watched her fingers trace the edge of the photo, hesitant, almost afraid to touch the memory. There was a silence that stretched between us, thick but tender, a shared acknowledgment of loss neither of us had voiced before. "You make it sound simple," she said finally, voice uneven. "But it wasn't. It's never that easy." "No," I agreed. "It's messy, and sometimes it hits when you least expect it." My words were small, almost an offering, but they seemed to matter. Her gaze lingered on mine longer this time, unguarded, almost trusting. She put the photo down and exhaled, a subtle quiver in her shoulders. "I guess I've been carrying it for a long time, pretending I wasn't." Her hands shook slightly, betraying the composure she usually wore like armor. I wanted to reach out, to say something that might ease it, but I stayed still. There was something in letting her bear it, in letting the silence hold us together, that felt necessary. The air seemed charged, heavy with unspoken understanding. I realized then that nothing had to be said for the moment to matter, that the acknowledgment itself was seismic. She looked up at me finally, eyes soft, almost apologetic, and whispered, "I didn't expect anyone to see this side of me." I nodded, heart tight, feeling the weight of the revelation. No words could capture it, but in that quiet space, the walls between us shifted imperceptibly. And when she smiled, small, fragile, almost guilty, it felt like the world had tilted just slightly, enough that nothing would ever feel entirely the same again. The shop was nearly empty that evening, the air thick with the scent of oil and rain-soaked concrete. She was leaning against the counter, hands wrapped around a mug of lukewarm coffee, eyes unfocused as if tracing a memory I couldn't reach. I stayed a few steps back, not wanting to intrude, but the silence between us was heavier than words. "You don't have to pretend anymore," I said quietly. My voice was low, careful, almost hesitant. She blinked slowly, meeting my gaze for the first time in what felt like hours, and the vulnerability in her eyes made me catch my breath. "I don't," she whispered. "Not with you. Not here." We didn't speak for a while. The quiet stretched, punctuated only by the soft hum of the heater and the occasional drip from the roof. And in that silence, I realized how much of this, the tension, the restraint, the longing, had been building between us, not in grand gestures, but in moments too small for anyone else to notice. I stepped closer, slow enough that she had time to retreat if she wanted, but she didn't. My hand hovered near hers, just inches away, until the heat from her fingers pressed against mine, a small, deliberate touch that said more than words ever could. She didn't pull away. She let it linger, and in that instant, everything shifted. Her eyes softened, and I saw the weariness, the fear, and the unspoken acknowledgment that whatever this was, it wasn't fleeting. It had been there all along, quiet but insistent, building in every glance, every brush of hands, every shared silence. We didn't speak of love, not yet. There was no dramatic confession, no poetic declaration, just a shared space, a mutual understanding that we had crossed some invisible threshold together, and the world outside the shop, its rules, its judgments, didn't matter here. I leaned slightly against the counter, letting our shoulders brush, and she didn't move. She tilted her head just enough that the warmth of her hair brushed my cheek, and I felt the tension I'd been holding for weeks ease, almost imperceptibly. A soft smile flickered across her lips, fleeting but genuine, and I mirrored it, careful not to break the fragile intimacy of the moment. We sat there like that for a long stretch, hands barely touching, breaths synchronized, letting the quiet carry the weight of what we couldn't yet say. And in that simple, unspoken way, everything settled. The hesitation, the tension, the nearly unbearable longing, they all folded into something quieter, more permanent, a foundation built slowly, carefully, earned through small moments rather than grand declarations. The rain started again outside, tapping against the windows in gentle rhythms, and we didn't move. The light from the lamp fell soft across her face, illuminating the silver in her hair, the faint creases of worry, the warmth in her eyes. I pressed my hand lightly over hers once more, and she didn't pull away. For the first time, it felt like we belonged in this silence together. And that was enough. I often think back to those quiet hours in the workshop, the ones that didn't feel like anything at the time, but somehow held everything. The rain, the oil, the small glances, the pauses between words. They built a rhythm I didn't understand until much later. Looking back, I realize how much we both changed in that space. She let herself be seen, not in grand confessions, but in tiny cracks of vulnerability that were more honest than any declaration could be. I learned to notice, to wait, to let silence speak as loudly as words. The tension, the hesitation, the almost moments, they taught me patience, empathy, and how fragile yet resilient love can be. She changed too, though perhaps she wouldn't have said so. The guardedness, the caution, softened, not vanished, but tempered with trust. She learned that someone could stay close without rushing, could witness without judgment, and that letting herself feel didn't have to mean losing control. We didn't need fireworks, or sweeping gestures, or poetic speeches. Our connection grew in the spaces others might have ignored. A shared glance across a cluttered counter, a brief brush of fingers, laughter that came quietly, almost shyly. Those small moments became anchors, grounding us in a love that was earned, patient, and entirely human. I still remember the touch of her hand that first evening we allowed ourselves to really feel it. The warmth of her presence without expectation, the quiet understanding that whatever this was, it was ours to shape. Every subtle gesture, every pause, every almost word. Those things mattered more than any grand confession ever could. Sometimes, when the world feels too loud or too fast, I return to that memory. I remember the soft hum of the heater, the rain against the windows, her hair brushing my cheek as we sat together in silence. And in that memory, I find a kind of peace, a reminder that love doesn't always need to shout. Sometimes, it just exists, in quiet, in patience, in shared understanding. We didn't need to speak the word love to know it. We simply lived it, day by day, moment by moment, learning how to hold each other without pressure, without fear, just presence. And that was more than enough. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?